The Ming Imperial Palace was a world of blinding splendor, a place where gold reflected sunlight like liquid fire, silk curtains whispered in the halls, and delicate porcelain glimmered in every corner. On the surface, it was the pinnacle of civilization, the very embodiment of refinement, artistry, and wealth. Visitors from distant lands often marveled at its grandeur, describing the corridors as endless rivers of color, the gardens as paradises sculpted by human hands, and the throne halls as monuments to power so absolute it seemed divine. Yet beneath the gilded veneer, a far darker reality lurked, one hidden behind the lacquered doors and secret corridors. The opulence that dazzled outsiders concealed a shadowy empire within, a world where human suffering was traded for knowledge, ambition, and control. In the hushed recesses of this empire, the royal servants lived lives that outsiders could scarcely imagine. They were the faceless hands that fed, cleaned, and maintained the court, yet their existence was far from mundane. Every gesture, every breath, every movement could be observed, measured, and manipulated for purposes that were both secretive and terrifying. These servants were more than mere employees. They were instruments in a grand experiment conducted under the unblinking eyes of emperors who sought to master life itself. Their bodies became tools, their health and humanity secondary to the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Obedience was not merely expected, it was extracted with a precision bordering on cruelty, enforced by a system where the slightest hesitation could be punished in ways that still echo in the annals of horror. This was a world where fear became an art form. The servants were trained, coerced, and sometimes broken to fit the emperor's vision. Discipline was intertwined with surveillance, rituals of punishment framed as lessons in loyalty, and humiliation wielded as a weapon to remind them of their place. And yet, even as terror pervaded every corner, the servants were also part of an elaborate spectacle. They moved through ornate halls, served lavish feasts, and participated in ceremonies that dazzled the court, all while concealing the silent terror that churned beneath their composed faces. The contrast between the serene surface and the hidden brutality created a psychological tension that would shape their very perception of reality, eroding their sense of self while elevating the emperor's absolute authority. The Ming emperors themselves were not merely rulers. They were observers, scientists, and orchestrators of human experience on a scale rarely imagined. Obsessed with longevity, perfection, and the mysteries of the body, they turned curiosity into cruelty, and study into experimentation. Royal servants became the living canvas for this dark ambition. They were subjected to tests that probed the limits of pain, endurance, and obedience. Some were exposed to strange concoctions, herbs, and poisons in the name of medicine and alchemy. Others were forced into extreme physical trials designed to measure the boundaries of human resilience. There was a perverse logic to these actions, rooted in superstition, secrecy, and an unyielding belief in the emperor's divine mandate. In this shadowed world, morality was pliable, and life itself became secondary to the pursuit of knowledge, power, and immortality. What makes this chapter of history so haunting is not merely the acts themselves but the mindset that allowed them. The palace was a paradox of beauty and horror, of serenity and terror, a place where one could witness exquisite art while hearing the muffled cries of those who had become experiments. There is something inherently fascinating, even forbidden, about peering behind the gilded walls and seeing the machinery of cruelty at work. It is a study in contrasts, the soft rustle of silk against the hard reality of human suffering, the serene smile of a courtesan alongside the trembling figure of a servant who knows that disobedience could mean death or worse. This is the duality that sets the stage for the stories that follow, a stage where curiosity, fear, and morality collide in ways that are both shocking and compelling. By stepping into this hidden world, the audience begins a journey not just through the history of the Ming Dynasty, but through the darker corners of human ambition. The luxurious halls, the ornate gardens, and the magnificent ceremonies are all part of a meticulously crafted narrative of control and power. Yet behind every gleaming surface is the whisper of suffering, the shadow of lives lived under constant surveillance, and the echo of experiments that tested the limits of humanity. It is here, in these contrasts, that the story begins, where awe meets horror, where fascination meets fear, and where the seemingly invincible empire reveals the fragility and torment of those who served its rulers. The world of the Ming court was built on a rigid hierarchy, a lattice of power that left no room for individuality or dissent. Every servant, every eunuch, every handmaiden understood their place within this intricate web, for stepping out of line could mean not only personal suffering but also a public example of the consequences of defiance. Control was not merely a matter of orders, it was a carefully orchestrated psychological strategy. The emperor, seated high above the polished floors and gilded pillars, did not need to punish openly every misstep. Fear alone, cultivated through subtle surveillance, whispered warnings, and the occasional gruesome spectacle, was enough to bend the will of those who served him. The palace itself became a laboratory for control, where obedience was studied, measured, and demanded with absolute precision. In this environment, the servant's every action was scrutinized. The smallest lapse, a misaligned tray, a faltering curtsy, a whispered complaint, could draw the emperor's attention, and once noticed, the consequences were swift and brutal. Punishments ranged from public humiliation to more sinister forms of correction, often disguised as loyalty tests or health experiments. This constant tension created a psychological landscape where trust was scarce, and the mind was always on edge. Servants learned to anticipate not only direct commands but the unspoken expectations of the court, turning the act of survival into an art form. They had to navigate the duality of life in the palace, performing their duties flawlessly while simultaneously concealing the terror that simmered beneath the surface. The hierarchy of the Ming court was meticulously maintained through elaborate rituals and ceremonies. A servant's status was defined not only by their role but by their proximity to power. Those closer to the emperor's personal chambers held more influence, yet they also faced greater scrutiny and more dangerous obligations. The paradox was clear: the higher one rose, the more exposed they became to the emperor's curiosity, his experiments, and his wrath. Life at the top of the servant hierarchy was a gilded cage, where privilege and peril were inseparable. Lower-ranking servants, while somewhat shielded from direct exposure, were often subjected to more overt forms of punishment, turning them into warnings for those who might aspire to step beyond their prescribed place. In this way, the court structure itself became a tool of psychological manipulation, ensuring obedience without constant overt enforcement. Surveillance in the Ming Palace was both physical and psychological. Eunuchs, spies, and informants acted as extensions of the emperor's gaze, ensuring that whispers of dissent never reached critical mass. Servants were often made complicit in observing one another, creating a network of mutual suspicion that eroded solidarity. The result was a constant internalized fear, a psychological cage as binding as any physical one. Every glance, every gesture, every interaction had the potential to carry consequences. The palace was a theater in which fear played the leading role, and each servant, knowingly or unknowingly, performed in a drama of control and submission. In this way, the Ming emperors perfected not only the art of governance but also the subtle engineering of human behavior. Beyond surveillance and hierarchy, the Ming court wielded ritual as a mechanism of control. Daily routines were laden with symbolism, from the order in which servants attended to their duties to the ceremonies that displayed their obedience. These rituals were not mere formalities, they were psychological tools that reinforced the emperor's absolute authority. The performance of obedience became a spectacle, a public reminder of the power dynamic, and a method of instilling discipline through repetition. Servants internalized these lessons, learning to anticipate expectations, manage fear, and navigate the complex social terrain of the palace. It was through ritual, hierarchy, and constant observation that the Ming court maintained an iron grip on those who served it, shaping both their actions and their very thoughts. The consequences of failure, intentional or otherwise, were not merely punitive but often experimental. The emperor's curiosity frequently intersected with the mechanisms of control, turning punishment into observation and coercion into study. Servants became subjects in a twisted dance of authority, where their reactions, endurance, and even survival were measured and recorded for the ruler's benefit. This created an environment where fear and obedience were inseparable, and where compliance was enforced not only by the threat of immediate consequences but by the omnipresent weight of expectation and surveillance. The palace became a psychological crucible, testing the limits of loyalty, fear, and the human will. Perhaps most disturbing was the normalization of this environment. Over time, both the emperor and his servants came to accept, even rationalize, these extremes of control. The palace's psychological architecture created a world in which cruelty was normalized, in which suffering was an accepted aspect of life, and in which the line between discipline and experimentation blurred. Servants adapted, surviving through a combination of fear, cunning, and internalized obedience. The emperor, in turn, learned to manipulate this system with increasing subtlety, refining methods that combine terror with routine, punishment with observation, and authority with experimentation. What emerges from this picture is a court where control was not only maintained but perfected, where power was absolute, and where human beings were both instruments and victims of a carefully calibrated system. The stage was thus set for the darker chapters to come, where the Ming Emperor's obsession with control and mastery of life would extend into realms previously unimaginable. The servants, conditioned by hierarchy, fear and ritual, were already primed to endure suffering, to obey without question, and to participate, willingly or not, in experiments that would push the boundaries of morality and humanity. It is in this crucible of power and surveillance, of obedience and terror, that the story of human experimentation in the Ming court truly begins, revealing not only the cruelty of absolute authority but also the resilience, fear and silent rebellion of those who lived in its shadow. The world of the Ming court was built on a rigid hierarchy, a lattice of power that left no room for individuality or dissent. Every servant, every eunuch, every handmaiden understood their place within this intricate web, for stepping out of line could mean not only personal suffering but also a public example of the consequences of defiance. Control was not merely a matter of orders. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological strategy. The emperor, seated high above the polished floors and gilded pillars, did not need to punish openly every misstep. Fear alone, cultivated through subtle surveillance, whispered warnings, and the occasional gruesome spectacle, was enough to bend the will of those who served him. The palace itself became a laboratory for control, where obedience was studied, measured, and demanded with absolute precision. In this environment, the servant's every action was scrutinized. The smallest lapse, a misaligned tray, a faltering curtsy, a whispered complaint, could draw the emperor's attention, and once noticed, the consequences were swift and brutal. Punishments ranged from public humiliation to more sinister forms of correction, often disguised as loyalty tests or health experiments. This constant tension created a psychological landscape where trust was scarce, and the mind was always on edge. Servants learned to anticipate not only direct commands but the unspoken expectations of the court, turning the act of survival into an art form. They had to navigate the duality of life in the palace, performing their duties flawlessly while simultaneously concealing the terror that simmered beneath the surface. The hierarchy of the Ming court was meticulously maintained through elaborate rituals and ceremonies. A servant's status was defined not only by their role but by their proximity to power. Those closer to the emperor's personal chambers held more influence, yet they also faced greater scrutiny and more dangerous obligations. The paradox was clear. The higher one rose, the more exposed they became to the emperor's curiosity, his experiments, and his wrath. Life at the top of the servant hierarchy was a gilded cage, where privilege and peril were inseparable. Lower-ranking servants, while somewhat shielded from direct exposure, were often subjected to more overt forms of punishment, turning them into warnings for those who might aspire to step beyond their prescribed place. In this way, the court structure itself became a tool of psychological manipulation, ensuring obedience without constant overt enforcement. Surveillance in the Ming palace was both physical and psychological. Eunuchs, spies, and informants acted as extensions of the emperor's gaze, ensuring that whispers of dissent never reached critical mass. Servants were often made complicit in observing one another, creating a network of mutual suspicion that eroded solidarity. The result was a constant internalized fear, a psychological cage as binding as any physical one. Every glance, every gesture, every interaction had the potential to carry consequences. The palace was a theater in which fear played the leading role, and each servant, knowingly or unknowingly, performed in a drama of control and submission. In this way, the Ming emperors perfected not only the art of governance but also the subtle engineering of human behavior. Beyond surveillance and hierarchy, the Ming court wielded ritual as a mechanism of control. Daily routines were laden with symbolism, from the order in which servants attended to their duties to the ceremonies that displayed their obedience. These rituals were not mere formalities, they were psychological tools that reinforced the emperor's absolute authority. The performance of obedience became a spectacle, a public reminder of the power dynamic, and a method of instilling discipline through repetition. Servants internalized these lessons, learning to anticipate expectations, manage fear, and navigate the complex social terrain of the palace. It was through ritual, hierarchy, and constant observation that the Ming court maintained an iron grip on those who served it, shaping both their actions and their very thoughts. The consequences of failure, intentional or otherwise, were not merely punitive but often experimental. The emperor's curiosity frequently intersected with the mechanisms of control, turning punishment into observation and coercion into study. Servants became subjects in a twisted dance of authority, where their reactions, endurance, and even survival were measured and recorded for the ruler's benefit. This created an environment where fear and obedience were inseparable, and where compliance was enforced not only by the threat of immediate consequences but by the omnipresent weight of expectation and surveillance. The palace became a psychological crucible, testing the limits of loyalty, fear, and the human will. Perhaps most disturbing was the normalization of this environment. Over time, both the emperor and his servants came to accept, even rationalize, these extremes of control. The palace's psychological architecture created a world in which cruelty was normalized, in which suffering was an accepted aspect of life, and in which the line between discipline and experimentation blurred. Servants adapted, surviving through a combination of fear, cunning, and internalized obedience. The emperor, in turn, learned to manipulate this system with increasing subtlety, refining methods that combine terror with routine, punishment with observation, and authority with experimentation. What emerges from this picture is a court where control was not only maintained but perfected, where power was absolute, and where human beings were both instruments and victims of a carefully calibrated system. The stage was thus set for the darker chapters to come, where the Ming Emperor's obsession with control and mastery of life would extend into realms previously unimaginable. The servants, conditioned by hierarchy, fear, and ritual, were already primed to endure suffering, to obey without question, and to participate, willingly or not, in experiments that would push the boundaries of morality and humanity. It is in this crucible of power and surveillance, of obedience and terror, that the story of human experimentation in the Ming court truly begins, revealing not only the cruelty of absolute authority but also the resilience, fear, and silent rebellion of those who lived in its shadow. Behind the palace walls, beyond the lavish ceremonies and ornate gardens, lay the emperor's most secretive obsession, the experimentation on human beings. While the outside world marveled at the brilliance of Ming civilization, the royal court concealed a far darker pursuit, one that blended science, superstition, and unrestrained cruelty. The emperor, enthralled by the promise of longevity, health, and mystical knowledge, saw the royal servants not as individuals but as instruments, living specimens in a grand, forbidden laboratory. Their bodies became canvases upon which the emperor and his court could test the boundaries of life itself. What might seem unimaginable to outsiders, the deliberate exposure of humans to poisons, extreme conditions, or invasive procedures, was in fact calculated and purposeful, driven by a desire to conquer mortality and harness the secrets of the human body. The experiments were as varied as they were cruel. Some servants were subjected to alchemical trials, consuming herbal concoctions designed to purge disease or extend life. These substances were often toxic in isolation, and their effects on the human body were unpredictable, ranging from vomiting and paralysis to agonizing death. Others were exposed to extreme physical conditions, chilling winds in the palace gardens, searing heat in controlled chambers, or prolonged periods of fasting, all to measure endurance and resistance. The emperor's obsession with the human body as a vessel of knowledge created scenarios where suffering was meticulously documented, observed, and refined. Each trial was a calculated step into uncharted territory, blending empirical curiosity with sadistic control, and each servant was a reluctant participant, caught between the demands of survival and the emperor's insatiable ambition. Records from the era, though scarce and often deliberately obfuscated, hint at the methodical nature of these experiments. Some servants were used to test the effects of poisons believed to cure disease or grant vitality, while others were subjected to invasive procedures, sometimes without anesthesia, under the guise of medical research. These acts were not random. They were designed to gather data, refine techniques, and test theories of the human body. The emperor, surrounded by a circle of trusted advisors and alchemists, approached these experiments with a meticulous attention to detail. Even the smallest physiological reaction was noted, measured, and compared to previous outcomes. In this way, the Ming court blurred the line between science and sadism, turning curiosity into cruelty and study into terror. The servants, stripped of agency and identity, had no choice but to comply. Some accepted their fate with grim resignation, understanding that survival depended on obedience, silence, and endurance. Others resisted in small ways, through subtle defiance, whispered warnings to one another, or silent attempts to evade the most extreme trials, but these acts of rebellion were rare and perilous. Failure to conform often meant death, disfigurement, or prolonged suffering, and the emperor's omnipresent gaze ensured that defiance was detected and punished swiftly. The psychological toll was immense. Fear became constant, and the servants' perception of reality was shaped by the knowledge that their bodies were not entirely their own. Every heartbeat, every breath, every movement carried weight, as though the palace itself was a clockwork machine measuring obedience and endurance in precise increments. Some of the most notorious experiments focused on longevity and immortality. The emperor, like many rulers before and after him, was captivated by the idea that life could be extended indefinitely through alchemy and medicine. Servants were often the test subjects for these mystical pursuits, ingesting elixirs composed of mercury, arsenic, and exotic herbs. The effects were devastating. Some survived only to endure weeks of debilitating illness, while others perished within hours. The palace physicians meticulously documented symptoms and reactions, noting which combinations produced prolonged vitality and which were fatal. The servants, forced to participate, became unwilling contributors to an obsession that conflated human curiosity with human cruelty. In this twisted pursuit, the boundary between science and sadism disappeared entirely, leaving only suffering and spectacle. It was not only physical suffering that characterized these experiments. Mental anguish was equally pervasive. Servants were often isolated for prolonged periods, subjected to sensory deprivation, or forced into extreme situations designed to test obedience and psychological endurance. These conditions created an environment of constant anxiety, paranoia, and stress, amplifying the effects of the physical trials. The emperor and his advisors observed not just the body, but the mind, treating fear, loyalty, and resilience as measurable variables. In this way, the palace became a laboratory not only of biology but of psychology, where terror itself was an instrument of study. The combination of mental and physical torment ensured that the servants were thoroughly controlled, their identities eroded, and their survival conditioned entirely on submission. The meticulous record-keeping of the Ming court further emphasizes the calculated nature of these experiments. Logs, medical notes, and imperial decrees reveal that outcomes were tracked and analyzed, creating an empirical framework around acts that, to modern eyes, appear monstrous. The servants' reactions, sweat, trembling, fainting, or even death, were catalogued and compared, providing the emperor with the knowledge he craved. This approach transformed individual suffering into data points, human agony into a pathway toward perceived enlightenment. Yet the moral cost was staggering. Each success in experimentation came at the expense of a servant's body, health, and often life, illustrating a chilling utilitarian calculus where human value was measured by usefulness to imperial ambition. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these experiments was their normalization within the palace. To outsiders, the idea of using humans as test subjects might seem unthinkable, but within the tightly controlled world of the Ming court, it became routine, accepted, and even rationalized. The servants, conditioned by fear, hierarchy, and ritual, were forced into roles where their humanity was secondary to the emperor's objectives. The courtiers and advisors, likewise, participated willingly or turned a blind eye, bound by loyalty, fear, or ambition. In this environment, cruelty and curiosity became inseparable, moral boundaries dissolved, and the palace itself was transformed into a theater of human experimentation. The grandeur and beauty of the imperial setting only deepened the horror, juxtaposing opulence with the suffering that lay just out of sight. By the end of this section, the audience begins to understand the chilling calculus of the Ming emperor. Human life was both precious and expendable, a resource to be studied, tested, and manipulated in pursuit of ultimate knowledge. The servants' bodies were instruments, their obedience a tool, and their suffering a necessary cost in a game that combined science, superstition, and absolute power. The stage is now fully set for the next layers of horror, the intimate details of the servants' physical torment, the psychological manipulation that made endurance possible, and the broader implications of a society that permitted such hidden cruelty behind a facade of beauty and ritual. Here, the audience is left suspended between disbelief and fascination, grappling with the dark reality of absolute authority and the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance. The human body became the ultimate canvas for the Ming emperor's obsession, and the royal servants were the unwilling artist's models, subjected to trials that tested every limit of flesh and bone. Their lives, once defined by service and ceremony, were reduced to a cycle of observation, endurance, and suffering. Each day brought new challenges: rigorous physical exertion designed to gauge strength, exposure to toxic substances intended to measure resistance, and invasive procedures that left no part of the body untouched by the emperor's curiosity. The palace corridors, which appeared pristine and orderly, were in reality the backdrop for a relentless theater of human torment, where each servant's body was both subject and spectacle, simultaneously instrument and victim. Pain, in this hidden world, was methodically applied and meticulously recorded. Servants were exposed to conditions that would have broken even the strongest individuals: extreme heat in sealed chambers, frigid winds sweeping through the gardens at dawn, prolonged periods of fasting that sapped strength and vitality. Some were made to endure physical stress while being observed by physicians, alchemists, and eunuchs, their reactions measured, their endurance noted, and their suffering catalogued as if it were a scientific experiment rather than a human life. Every tremor, every shiver, every groan was a data point, a reflection of the human body's fragility, and a testament to the emperor's obsession with testing its limits. In this world, survival depended not only on obedience but on the capacity to endure what the mind struggled to comprehend. The invasive experiments went even further. Servants were sometimes subjected to procedures that involved cutting, cauterization, or the administration of toxic compounds under the guise of medical research or alchemy. These trials were often conducted without anesthesia, leaving the subjects fully aware of their suffering, and intensifying both physical pain and psychological trauma. In some cases, entire systems of the body were tested in sequence. Circulation, digestion, and nervous response, all observed and recorded meticulously. It was a world where the servant's own body became a tool of imperial ambition, where their flesh and blood were manipulated not for healing but for knowledge, and where the boundary between care and cruelty had long vanished. The very act of being alive was transformed into a state of vulnerability, each heartbeat a reminder of the emperor's absolute dominion. Yet beyond the physical torment, there was a deeper, more insidious form of suffering, the stripping of identity. Servants were reduced to mere vessels, their individuality erased in the process of experimentation. Names were forgotten, personal histories ignored, and humanity subordinated to the emperor's curiosity. This psychological control compounded the physical agony, creating a state of complete submission where fear, obedience, and the anticipation of the next trial dominated every thought. Even the smallest acts of autonomy, choosing when to rest, what to eat, or how to move, were curtailed, reinforcing the relentless power of the palace. The servant's sense of self, already fragile, was gradually replaced by a functional existence. Endure, obey, survive. The contrast between the beauty of the palace and the suffering within could not have been more striking. Outside, the gardens bloomed with precision, koi swam in crystal-clear ponds, and delicate lanterns reflected in polished marble. Inside, however, servants were pushed to their limits, their bodies subjected to tests that would have seemed unimaginable to the casual observer. This stark juxtaposition, the serene elegance of the Ming court against the hidden horror of human experimentation, created a psychological tension that was part of the palace's design. The emperor, consciously or unconsciously, leveraged this contrast to maintain control, embedding fear within the very aesthetic of the court. Every exquisite hall became a silent witness to pain, every ornate corridor a stage for endurance, every polished floor a reminder that beauty and cruelty could coexist. Some servants endured these trials with remarkable resilience. Their bodies, though tested and tormented, adapted to the harsh conditions, and their minds, though constantly pressured, found ways to cope with fear and suffering. Yet not all survived, and the loss of life was often concealed, sanitized, or repurposed as a lesson for the living. Death itself became a tool of control, a silent threat hanging over every chamber, a warning that failure was not merely personal but inevitable without obedience. Those who survived carried the marks of their endurance, scars, weakened bodies, and permanent psychological trauma, as invisible badges of compliance and survival in a system designed to strip humanity in the name of imperial ambition. The servant's ordeal also served another, darker purpose. It reinforced the emperor's image as both omnipotent and omniscient. By turning human bodies into instruments of observation, the emperor projected control over life and death, demonstrating his power to manipulate not only events but flesh and spirit. Servants became living embodiments of this authority, their suffering silently echoing throughout the palace and into the consciousness of all who served. The physical and psychological torment intertwined, creating an environment where obedience was learned through experience rather than instruction, where fear was internalized, and where the palace itself became a living classroom of control and domination. This relentless cycle of suffering, observation, and endurance is what made the Ming court so uniquely terrifying. The servants' bodies were no longer their own, they were extensions of imperial curiosity, instruments of experimentation, and victims of a system that valued knowledge and power above human life. Yet in this darkness, there was also a perverse fascination, a hidden testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty. By examining the servant's ordeal, the audience is invited to confront not only the mechanics of physical suffering but also the psychological dimensions of absolute authority, fear, and submission. It is a world where beauty masks horror, and where survival demands a negotiation between endurance, fear, and the faintest glimmer of hope. The stage is now set for the next chapter, where the psychological mechanisms of obedience and terror will be explored in even greater detail. The physical trials are only part of the story. The mental manipulation, the internalized fear, and the constant surveillance combined to create a palace in which the servants' very thoughts were shaped by the emperor's will. Here the audience begins to see not just the human cost of experimentation, but the complex interplay of control, fear, and resilience that defined life in the Ming court, setting the foundation for the psychological horrors that followed. The true horror of life in the Ming palace extended far beyond the physical trials endured by the royal servants. While the body could be tested, measured, and catalogued, it was the mind that became the most vulnerable instrument of control. Psychological manipulation permeated every aspect of palace life, shaping behavior, suppressing dissent, and normalizing cruelty. Fear was not merely a reaction to punishment, it was cultivated, refined, and weaponized with precision. Servants learned to anticipate the unseen gaze of the emperor, the subtle signals of eunuchs, and the whispers of informants hidden in the labyrinthine corridors. Every glance, every gesture, every hesitated step could carry consequence. This was a palace where obedience was no longer just expected, it was engineered. The psychological architecture of the Ming court relied on a delicate balance of terror, expectation, and ritual. Servants were constantly reminded of their place through both overt and subtle means. A misplaced tray, a delayed bow, or even a hint of hesitation could result in public humiliation, withdrawal of privileges, or more sinister forms of punishment disguised as medical or alchemical experiments. Over time, these repeated stressors conditioned the mind, producing a state of hypervigilance in which the servant's entire perception of reality was filtered through fear. Life became a continuous negotiation with an invisible, omnipotent authority. The mind, like the body, was measured, observed, and manipulated, leaving the servants in a state of perpetual anxiety where survival required not only obedience but psychological flexibility, cunning, and the suppression of any internal dissent. Isolation was another critical tool in the emperor's psychological arsenal. Some servants were deliberately separated from the rest of the court for days, weeks, or even months. During this time, sensory deprivation, silence, and uncertainty worked together to erode mental resilience. The mind, starved of social interaction and reassured routine, became highly malleable. When these individuals were returned to the larger group, they were more compliant, more fearful, and more willing to endure the next round of experiments or trials. This deliberate manipulation of mental state was not accidental. It was a calculated strategy, designed to produce obedience that extended beyond mere fear of physical punishment. In essence, the emperor had mastered a form of psychological engineering long before the term existed. The use of informants and surveillance intensified this manipulation. Eunuchs, court advisors, and fellow servants were often complicit in monitoring behavior, reporting even the smallest deviations. This created a culture of distrust that infiltrated every corner of palace life. Servants became spies of one another, learning to conceal true thoughts and intentions behind a veneer of compliance. Friendship, loyalty, and solidarity were dangerous, as they could be perceived as collusion or disloyalty. In this way, the palace's internal structure reinforced fear, using the social environment as a weapon. Servants internalized the emperor's omnipotence, and over time the surveillance apparatus extended into their own consciousness, producing self-policing behavior that required little external enforcement. The psychological chains were as binding as the physical ones, if not more so. Even small rituals contributed to this pervasive mental control. Daily routines were laden with symbolic meaning, from the sequence of dressing to the precise order of serving meals. Each act reinforced hierarchy, obedience, and the invisible threat of consequence. Every time a servant participated in these rituals, they were reminded of their role as both subordinate and instrument of imperial curiosity. Over time, the repetition of these routines instilled a conditioned response. Fear and compliance became reflexive. The palace had become a psychological crucible where habit, expectation, and terror merged to produce a population of human beings whose thoughts, reactions, and behaviors were systematically shaped to serve the emperor's will. The emperor's fascination with human behavior did not stop at observation. Psychological endurance itself became a measure of utility. Servants were exposed to situations that provoked intense anxiety or emotional stress, and their reactions were meticulously noted. Would a servant comply when placed in life-threatening conditions? Would fear break their spirit or sharpen their obedience? These experiments were not merely about survival, they were about molding the mind, testing loyalty, and documenting resilience. The palace had become both a laboratory and a stage, where the emperor orchestrated emotional tension and observed the human response to fear, uncertainty, and coercion. The servants' psychological suffering, though invisible to outsiders, was every bit as engineered as the physical torment they endured. One of the most insidious aspects of this psychological control was its normalization. Over time, servants internalized fear to such an extent that disobedience seemed unthinkable. They learned to anticipate punishment before it occurred, to read subtle cues of danger, and to comply automatically with the emperor's demands. Fear became not only a reaction but a way of life, a lens through which every action was filtered. This internalization of terror ensured that obedience was maintained without the need for constant oversight. The palace had cultivated a form of loyalty that was rooted not in respect or admiration, but in survival, conditioning, and a deep, unshakable fear of reprisal. Yet even in this environment of constant surveillance and psychological manipulation, subtle forms of resistance persisted. Some servants learned to protect their minds, finding ways to cope with fear through secret rituals, mental exercises, or quiet acts of defiance. Others discovered that endurance itself could become a form of rebellion, surviving an experiment, maintaining composure under torture, or resisting panic were victories in a world designed to strip them of agency. These moments, though small and fleeting, demonstrated that the human mind retains resilience even under extreme conditions. The emperor's psychological mastery was formidable, yet it was never absolute, and these glimpses of defiance highlight the tension between control and the human will, a tension that would persist throughout the servants' lives. This intricate dance of fear, obedience, and psychological manipulation illustrates the emperor's sophisticated understanding of human nature. By turning the mind into an instrument of control, the Ming court ensured that servants could be subjected to both physical and mental extremes while minimizing rebellion. The interplay between psychological conditioning and physical suffering created a comprehensive system of domination, where every aspect of existence, from thought to action, was mediated by fear and surveillance. It is here, in the depths of psychological torment, that the full horror of the Ming court emerges, a world where absolute power is maintained not only through brutality but through the meticulous shaping of the human mind, where terror becomes habitual, obedience becomes reflexive, and the very act of survival demands the suppression of fear itself. By the end of this section, the audience comes to understand that the Ming court's cruelty was as much psychological as it was physical. The servants' endurance was not just a matter of flesh and bone, but of thought, emotion, and the constant negotiation of fear. Their minds were instruments, their obedience a product of engineering, and their suffering both visible and invisible. This sets the stage for the next chapter, which will explore the emperor's obsession with alchemy, mystical remedies, and the deadly pursuit of immortality, where the intersection of curiosity, superstition, and cruelty reaches its most extreme expression. The Ming emperor's obsession with immortality and alchemy was a driving force behind some of the most terrifying practices within the palace walls. To outsiders, the pursuit of longevity may have seemed noble, a quest for wisdom and health. Yet for those living within the gilded corridors of the imperial court, this obsession transformed into a nightmare, a relentless series of experiments where human life was secondary to the emperor's pursuit of eternal existence. Royal servants were at the center of these efforts, coerced into consuming dangerous elixirs, participating in grueling rituals, and enduring procedures designed to unlock the secrets of longevity. The pursuit of immortality was no longer a philosophical ideal, it was a tangible obsession, one that turned curiosity into cruelty and science into a theater of horror. Alchemical experimentation within the Ming palace was as exotic as it was deadly. Servants were forced to ingest compounds crafted from mercury, arsenic, and a variety of rare herbs and minerals, all believed to possess life-extending properties. While some ingredients were relatively benign, many were inherently toxic, capable of inducing nausea, convulsions, or death. The palace physicians and alchemists monitored each reaction meticulously, taking detailed notes on the effects, survival rates, and physical deterioration of their subjects. These trials were methodical and unrelenting, blending empirical observation with superstition. Every failure was analyzed, every symptom catalogued, and every reaction became a data point in the emperor's relentless pursuit of immortality. Human suffering was thus transformed into research, and the palace itself became a laboratory of fear and endurance. Beyond ingestion, the emperor's obsession extended to physical trials designed to test the body's resilience under extreme conditions. Some servants were subjected to prolonged fasting or forced to perform arduous labor while weakened by toxins, while others were exposed to extreme temperatures or sensory deprivation to observe the effects on stamina and mental fortitude. These trials were intended not only to measure physical endurance but also to gauge the human body's ability to adapt to stress and survive conditions thought to confer longevity. The servants' bodies were pushed to their absolute limits, their agony meticulously documented, and their lives treated as instruments in the pursuit of a goal that was as mystical as it was horrifying. Pain, deprivation, and exposure became metrics, and endurance became a form of coerced contribution to the emperor's obsessions. The psychological dimension of these experiments was equally intense. Servants knew that each trial carried the potential for permanent injury or death. The constant awareness of danger amplified physical suffering, creating a psychological strain that few could endure unscathed. Fear became a daily companion, shaping every decision and movement. Obedience, in this context, was enforced as much through the anticipation of harm as through its actual application. The servants' mental states were observed alongside their physical reactions, providing the emperor and his advisors with an unprecedented understanding of human resilience, stress, and fear. This dual focus on mind and body exemplified the Ming court's approach to experimentation. Nothing was left to chance, and every aspect of human existence was subject to imperial scrutiny. Alchemy was not merely a scientific pursuit, it was intertwined with the emperor's spiritual and philosophical beliefs. Longevity was equated with divine favor, and the elixirs, rituals, and procedures were infused with symbolism, mystical significance, and ceremonial precision. The act of enduring these trials was framed as a form of spiritual service, a reflection of loyalty to the emperor and submission to his vision. For the servants, this created a complex moral and psychological paradox. They were simultaneously victims and participants in a ritual that promised enlightenment or reward to the observer while guaranteeing suffering to the subject. The fusion of superstition, ritual, and experimentation intensified the horror, blurring the line between devotion and exploitation. Some of the most dangerous substances tested were believed to enhance longevity or confer supernatural strength. Mercury, a common ingredient in imperial alchemy, was known even at the time to be toxic, yet it was administered to servants in carefully calculated doses. Arsenic and other minerals were similarly used, often combined with rare herbs imported from distant provinces. Servants ingested these compounds over extended periods, their health deteriorating under the emperor's scrutiny. The palace physicians observed changes in skin, hair, digestion, and neurological function, recording every symptom as if it were a laboratory measurement. In this context, the human body became both instrument and obstacle, a fragile vessel upon which the emperor's ambition could be projected, manipulated, and analyzed. The combination of physical suffering, toxic ingestion, and psychological stress created an environment where survival was as much about luck as endurance. Many servants succumbed to the harsh treatments, while others endured, their resilience a testament to both human adaptability and the unrelenting pressure of fear. For those who survived, the experience left lasting scars, physical, psychological, and emotional. Their bodies bore the marks of the emperor's obsession, and their minds carried the trauma of repeated exposure to extreme suffering. Yet, paradoxically, these survivors also became valuable assets to the emperor, living proof that certain individuals could endure what others could not. Their endurance reinforced the palace's hierarchy of power, survival, and obedience, and illustrated the cruel efficiency of the Ming court's approach to experimentation. The alchemical obsession extended beyond individual trials to the creation of elaborate ceremonial rituals designed to amplify the perceived efficacy of elixirs and experiments. Servants were sometimes required to participate in symbolic acts, chant incantations, or assume positions believed to channel mystical energies into their bodies. These rituals were intended to maximize the effects of the substances administered, to align the physical with the spiritual, and to demonstrate the emperor's mastery over life itself. For the servants, these ceremonies added an additional layer of psychological torment, demanding compliance not only with physical trials but with the emperor's mystical expectations. The palace had become a world where suffering, ritual, and obsession were inseparable, and where human life was subordinated entirely to the pursuit of an impossible ideal. Perhaps most chillingly, the emperor's pursuit of immortality normalized cruelty on an institutional level. Courtiers, physicians, and eunuchs became complicit, performing their roles in observation, administration, and enforcement with meticulous precision. Fear, loyalty, and ambition intertwined to sustain a system in which the extraordinary suffering of the servants was both routine and justified. The palace itself became a theater in which power, obsession, and experimentation converged, a place where the boundaries of morality, humanity, and survival were continually tested. The servants' lives were measured not in years lived but in endurance, obedience, and the contribution to the emperor's obsessive quest. In this way, the pursuit of immortality became a lens through which cruelty, curiosity, and the limits of human endurance could be studied and exploited. By the end of this section, the audience is left to confront the terrifying convergence of science, superstition, and absolute power. The Ming Emperor's obsession with alchemy and longevity transformed the palace into a world where human bodies were instruments, obedience was measured, and suffering was both methodical and normalized. Servants were caught at the intersection of curiosity and cruelty, their lives dictated by the emperor's desire to transcend mortality. This chapter of the narrative sets the stage for the exploration of rare moments of resistance, rebellion, and the human spirit's flickers of defiance. The delicate, precarious tension between control and resilience that would persist even in the shadow of extreme suffering. The Byzantine Empire, a civilization known for its political sophistication, grandiose culture, and powerful influence on the course of history, was also a society where cruelty became deeply intertwined with the very concept of honor. As the centuries passed, a shift occurred in the imperial court. What was once a symbol of mercy, compassion, and justice began to be replaced by a cold, unyielding sense of duty that valued strength and decisiveness over empathy and forgiveness. The idea of showing mercy, which was once considered an emperor's divine prerogative, began to be viewed with suspicion, as a weakness that could lead to betrayal and undermine imperial authority. This transformation didn't happen overnight. In the earlier years of the Byzantine Empire, rulers like Emperor Justinian sought to balance their immense political power with some semblance of compassion. Laws, though strict, were tempered by the moral framework of Christianity, which valued forgiveness and mercy as core virtues. However, as political strife, court conspiracies, and constant threats to the throne grew more frequent, emperors increasingly saw mercy as a liability. The more fragile the emperor's position became, the more tempting it was to lean into cruelty as a way to cement control and send a clear message to potential challengers. The Byzantine court's intense power struggles gave rise to emperors who ruled with iron fists, believing that to show mercy was to invite disloyalty and betrayal. Public executions, brutal tortures, and violent retributions were no longer viewed merely as tools of punishment. They became symbols of authority and strength. Emperors who engaged in such acts were not seen as merciless tyrants but as strong, decisive rulers, demonstrating their ability to maintain control of the empire and assert divine justice. One of the most infamous examples of this shift is found in the reign of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. Although his military victories were significant, it was his brutal use of punishment to eliminate enemies, both internal and external, that truly solidified his grip on power. He executed traitors with ruthless efficiency and would go to extreme lengths to rid the empire of any threat, no matter how small. He once ordered the blinding of his own cousin, a gruesome act that served as both a punishment and a public statement of his absolute power. The act was not viewed as an aberration, but as a necessary action to preserve the stability of the empire, and it was applauded by those who feared the consequences of defying the emperor. As the empire continued to face internal division and external threats, the idea of mercy became further removed from imperial governance. The more the rulers relied on cruelty to maintain order, the more it entrenched itself in the political culture. In this atmosphere, the concept of mercy wasn't just ignored, it was replaced by a culture where violence was seen as a legitimate form of governance, and even a demonstration of divine favor. To spare one's enemies was to risk showing weakness. In the Byzantine court, cruelty was not just a tool for punishment, it was a badge of honor. By the time of the empire's decline, this rejection of mercy had become so entrenched that it contributed directly to the empire's downfall. The disintegration of mercy in favor of cruelty created a paranoid, distrustful environment in which alliances were fragile, loyalty was fleeting, and the violence that once helped preserve the empire ultimately became the very force that eroded it from within. The tragic irony of the Byzantine Empire is that its rulers, in their obsessive pursuit of absolute power, lost sight of the core virtues that had once defined their civilization. The brutality they used to secure their thrones left them alone and vulnerable, unable to reclaim the moral high ground, until the empire crumbled under the weight of its own cruelty. The death of mercy in the Byzantine Empire is not just a story of political decline, it is a timeless reminder that the cost of power, when it is bought through violence and fear, can destroy the very foundation of a civilization. The Byzantine Empire, with its intricate history of grandeur and cruelty, left an indelible mark on both human civilization and human nature. The empire's stories of power, betrayal, and suffering continue to resonate, offering chilling reminders of the darker aspects of humanity's quest for control. The brutal punishments and torturous rituals that defined Byzantine governance were not merely acts of violence. They were reflections of a deep belief in the sanctity of power and the necessity of suffering. As we reflect on the Byzantine legacy, we must ask ourselves, what does this history tell us about the cost of absolute power, the pursuit of glory, and the psychological toll on those who wield authority? At its height, the Byzantine Empire was a beacon of culture, art, and intellectual achievement. The Hagia Sophia and the Justinian Code stand as symbols of Byzantine brilliance, shaping the course of Western civilization. However, beneath the empire's cultural and architectural achievements lay a darker truth: its reliance on cruelty as a tool for maintaining order and power. The paradox of the empire, where beauty and brutality coexisted, was perhaps its most defining feature. The rulers of Byzantium, revered as divinely appointed figures, wielded their power through violence, often justifying it as a divine mandate to restore order and protect the empire. This duality, the creation of stunning works of art alongside some of the most brutal methods of punishment, speaks to a larger moral question that still resonates today. Can cruelty be justified in the pursuit of justice and order? In the Byzantine Empire, the answer was often yes. Mercy in this system was seen as a weakness, while cruelty was considered necessary to maintain control over a fractured empire. The emperor, wielding the power of life and death, was not just a political figure. He was a divine instrument of justice, and his ability to mete out cruel punishment was seen as a sign of his strength and divine favor. Yet the true cost of this obsession with power and control was immense. The emperors too were consumed by the very cruelty they used to govern. Many emperors who ruled with iron fists became isolated and paranoid, their minds eroded by the pressure of maintaining absolute control. The very system they created, one built on suffering and punishment, eventually turned inward, destroying the rulers themselves. What began as a tool to secure their reign became a prison of their own making. This psychological toll was not just limited to the emperors. The Byzantine court, rife with intrigue, betrayal, and constant power struggles, became a breeding ground for paranoia and distrust. Even the most loyal courtiers were not safe from the whims of the emperor. Loyalty itself became a transactional currency, and betrayal was an ever-present threat. The violence that characterized the court not only fractured families but also destroyed the moral fabric of the empire. As we look at the modern world, the Byzantine legacy serves as both a cautionary tale and a mirror to our own political systems. The empire's reliance on cruelty to maintain power and control is not just a relic of the past. In many places today, the same dynamics of fear, manipulation, and violence persist. The lessons of the Byzantine Empire remind us of the dangers of unchecked power, where cruelty becomes a means of asserting authority and where mercy is viewed as a threat to stability. Ultimately, the fall of the Byzantine Empire was not just a political collapse. It was the result of a system built on cruelty and fear. The very tools the empire used to maintain its power, violence, intimidation, and a refusal to show mercy, led to its undoing. As the empire crumbled, so too did its moral foundation. In the end, the Byzantine Empire's tragic legacy is a stark reminder that when cruelty is allowed to flourish unchecked, it consumes everything in its path, leaving only destruction and despair. The culmination of the Ming Emperor's obsession with control, experimentation, and immortality left an indelible mark on those who lived under his authority. The physical and psychological toll on the royal servants was immense, but the consequences extended far beyond their bodies and minds. Fear, obedience, and suffering became woven into the very fabric of palace life, leaving survivors haunted by memories that no ritual or ceremony could erase. Every experiment, every trial, every act of coerced compliance contributed to a culture in which cruelty was normalized, moral boundaries were blurred, and human life was treated as a means to an end. The palace, for all its beauty, became a monument to the darker capacities of power, ambition, and human curiosity unrestrained by ethics or empathy. The servants bore the brunt of this calculated cruelty, their bodies and minds transformed into instruments of imperial obsession. Scars, physical deformities, and chronic ailments were visible reminders of what had been endured. Yet the psychological consequences were even more profound. Survivors carried an invisible burden: trauma, anxiety, and hypervigilance that persisted long after the trials ended. Fear had become an internalized companion, shaping thoughts, behaviors, and responses to the world beyond the palace walls. The emperor's experiments had demonstrated not only the fragility of the human body but also the malleability of the human mind, illustrating how absolute authority could reshape both life and perception, leaving deep, lasting imprints on those subjected to it. The moral implications of these experiments were staggering. What began as an obsessive quest for immortality and knowledge evolved into a system that treated human beings as disposable objects. The servant's suffering was justified in the name of progress, alchemy, and imperial ambition, revealing the chilling efficiency of a hierarchy that prioritized curiosity and power over empathy. Those who survived were forced to reconcile their experiences with a world that demanded both silence and loyalty. Moral reflection, when possible, became an internal struggle. How does one reconcile the desire for life with the knowledge that it has been used as a tool for experimentation? How does one endure atrocities without losing the essence of humanity? These questions, left unanswered within the palace, haunt our understanding of history and human nature. The legacy of the emperor's experiments also extends to the palace culture itself. The mechanisms of control, fear, surveillance, ritual, and psychological manipulation ensured obedience not only during life but in shaping the collective memory of those who survived. Stories of suffering, survival, and endurance were passed quietly among the servants, serving as warnings, lessons, and reminders of power's reach. Even in the absence of direct observation, the internalization of fear ensured that the system of control persisted. The palace became a microcosm of absolute authority, illustrating how cruelty, when institutionalized, can endure across generations, embedding itself in culture, behavior, and memory. Yet within this horror, there are glimpses of resilience, ingenuity, and the persistence of the human spirit. The servants' survival, their subtle acts of resistance, and their capacity to maintain a sense of identity amidst relentless control speak to an enduring truth. Even in the darkest corners of human history, the will to endure and assert autonomy survives. These stories, though overshadowed by suffering, offer a counterpoint to the narrative of cruelty, highlighting the tension between power and resilience that defines human experience. Endurance becomes both a testament to human adaptability and a subtle critique of the systems that seek to dominate life entirely. The psychological and physical scars of these experiments also force a reflection on the nature of curiosity, ambition, and morality. The emperor's pursuit of knowledge and immortality illustrates the dangers of unbridled obsession, particularly when combined with absolute power. Curiosity, when divorced from ethical consideration, can lead to extraordinary innovation or unfathomable cruelty. The Ming Palace, in this sense, serves as both a cautionary tale and a psychological case study. The human capacity for cruelty is amplified by power, and the mechanisms of control, fear, ritual, manipulation, can render suffering systematic, normalized, and enduring. The servant's plight underscores the ethical responsibility inherent in authority and experimentation, reminding us that progress achieved at the expense of humanity leaves a legacy of trauma that endures long after the immediate events have passed. The visual and emotional contrasts within the palace further underscore the horror of these practices. Outside, the grandeur of the Ming court, the intricate architecture, the serene gardens, the flowing rivers, and the gilded halls, suggested beauty, order, and refinement. Inside, however, lay a hidden world of suffering, psychological manipulation, and coerced experimentation. This juxtaposition, the serene aesthetics of power masking human suffering, heightened the psychological impact, illustrating how cruelty can be disguised behind elegance, ritual, and spectacle. It is this tension between the visible beauty of civilization and the invisible horror beneath that leaves a lingering impression on the imagination, forcing the audience to grapple with the duality of human achievement and human cruelty. The servants' stories, often unrecorded or deliberately erased from official histories, nevertheless persist in fragments, whispered accounts, subtle records, and traces in the material culture of the palace. They remind us that history is not only composed of triumphs and grandeur but also of suffering, endurance, and moral ambiguity. The Ming Emperor's experiments, while extreme, illuminate broader truths about power, control, and human resilience. They compel us to consider the cost of curiosity and ambition when untethered from ethical constraints, and they force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the limits of human endurance, the capacity for cruelty, and the resilience of the spirit in the face of systematic oppression. By the end of this section, the audience is left to reflect on the profound human and moral cost of the emperor's obsession. The physical suffering, psychological torment, and ethical violations endured by the servants demonstrate the terrifying potential of absolute authority and unchecked ambition. Yet the endurance, subtle defiance, and quiet resilience of those subjected to these horrors also illuminate the enduring strength of the human spirit. The palace, a monument to both cruelty and survival, leaves the audience suspended between awe and horror, compelled to examine the interplay of power, suffering, and morality in human history. It is this tension, between darkness and resilience, fear and ingenuity, cruelty and endurance, that defines the haunting legacy of the Ming Emperor's experiments and ensures that the story resonates long after it has been told. The story of the Ming Emperor's experiments on his royal servants does not end with the closing of palace gates or the death of those who endured the trials. Its echoes stretch far beyond the gilded halls, revealing the terrifying consequences of unchecked power, obsession, and the human capacity for cruelty. The emperor's pursuit of immortality, his manipulation of bodies and minds, and the systematic infliction of suffering illuminate the darkest extremes of human ambition. Yet even in this darkness, the servant's resilience and subtle defiance reveal the enduring strength of the human spirit, a quiet assertion of identity and will against overwhelming oppression. The palace, with its combination of surveillance, ritual, and experimentation, became a world in which life was measured by endurance and obedience. Servants were treated as instruments, their bodies and minds manipulated to satisfy the emperor's obsession. Physical suffering, scars, chronic ailments, and long-term health damage was compounded by psychological trauma. Anxiety, hypervigilance, and fear became internalized companions, shaping thought and behavior long after the trials ended. These experiences demonstrate how absolute authority can redefine human value, reduce life to function, and normalize cruelty. Yet they also reveal that the human mind and body retain resilience, finding ways to endure, adapt, and resist even in the most oppressive circumstances. The moral cost of the emperor's obsession is staggering. Knowledge, progress, and ambition were pursued at the expense of human life, ethical boundaries ignored, and empathy rendered irrelevant. The palace's horrors force reflection on the limits of curiosity and power. At what point does the pursuit of knowledge justify human suffering? How can authority be exercised responsibly without sacrificing morality? These questions remain timeless, echoing in modern debates about scientific ethics, governance, and human rights. The servant's suffering serves as a stark reminder that the pursuit of greatness, when divorced from ethical constraints, carries profound consequences. The stark contrast between the palace's outward beauty and the hidden horrors within amplifies the psychological impact. Gilded architecture, serene gardens, and ceremonial grandeur masked a world of suffering, surveillance, and coercion. This juxtaposition, splendor concealing cruelty, forces the audience to confront the duality of human civilization, where aesthetic achievement and cultural sophistication coexist with profound oppression. The servant's quiet endurance highlights the tension between visible triumph and hidden suffering, reinforcing the moral complexity of history and the precariousness of human life under absolute power. Despite the terror, subtle defiance persisted. Servants maintained private mental worlds, clung to memories, and exercised small acts of resistance within the confines of fear. Endurance itself became rebellion, a quiet refusal to surrender fully to oppression. Acts of solidarity, clever maneuvering, and survival strategies illustrate the human capacity for agency even when autonomy is severely restricted. These glimpses of resilience stand in stark contrast to the emperor's cruelty, demonstrating that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity finds ways to endure. Ultimately, the Ming Emperor's experiments force us to reflect on power, morality, and human nature. They reveal the consequences of obsession divorced from ethics, the mechanisms of control that can warp body and mind, and the enduring capacity of humans to adapt, survive, and resist. The servant's plight, though hidden for centuries, serves as both a warning and a testament. Cruelty can be systematized and normalized, but the human spirit retains the power to navigate, endure, and assert identity. History remembers the emperor for his ambition and obsession, but it is the quiet courage, ingenuity, and resilience of the servants that speak most profoundly to the complexity and endurance of human nature.